Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 487th episode, Sabrina's kicking it off with a new ornithopod dinosaur.
Yes, and it's got a surprising tail.
Nice. I'm excited to hear about that. I've got a new enantiornithine, which is usually, we would describe them as toothed birds, but this one is toothless.
Mm-hmm.
And way earlier than a lot of other toothless birds, which is pretty cool.
That is cool. We also look at how long did it take for fossils in Australia to turn into opal, and how much do really exceptional fossil sites influence our understanding of how animals changed over time. Plus, we've got dinosaur of the day, Zanclodon.
That's a fun name.
Technically not a dinosaur, but we'll get into that.
Okay. And I've got a fun fact, which is all about teeth. Speaking of odon, which means tooth, and basically how and why so many dinosaurs lost their teeth. But before we get into all of that, as always, we'd like to thank some of our patrons for helping to keep our podcast running. And this week we have a new patron to thank, and that's Dennis. Thank you very much for joining. And then rounding out our shout outs, we've got Sonia, Tiffany, TRX Dinosaurs, Jeff, Julia, Micah Marcos Music, Laurasaurus, Binder Clip Chick, and Anne.
Thank you so much for being a dino at all. It means a lot to us. And we could not keep doing this podcast or other cool stuff like our monthly I Know Paleo without our community. Jumping into the news, we're starting off with the new ornithopod.
Yeah, I think ornithopods tend to get higher billing than enantiornithines.
Neither of them are talked about as much as other dinosaurs.
They're both pretty low on the hierarchy of dinosaurs, if we're being honest.
Oh, I think this one's cool. It's a new ornithopod that was found in Argentina. Chakisaurus nekul. This was published in Cretaceous research by Rodrigo Alvarez Noguera and others. So, why, you might ask, is this one so exciting? Well, its tail and arms tell us a lot about elasmarian ornithopods. And that's that group that lived in the Cretaceous in what's now South America, Antarctica, and Australia. And it includes a lot of dinosaurs that were previously considered to be quote-unquote hypsilophodonts.
Oh, yeah. Hypsilophodonts.
Mm-hmm.
The word, it's almost like a curse word. Like, people don't like it when you say it.
Oh.
Because it's that group is a mess.
Well, now we talk mostly about elasmarian ornithopods.
Doesn't roll off the tongue as well. I guess hypsilophodonts is a little awkward too.
I think elasmarian sounds nice though.
It does, you're right.
So yeah, this group, they walked on two legs, they had long tails and relatively long necks. But this new dinosaur helps show how elasmarians were different from other ornithopods, because it's got some unique traits in the tail. And they found most of the tail. Ornithopod tails are not well known, especially in elasmarians. And previously, well, usually ornithopod tails are thought to be held horizontally.
You mean like off the ground completely?
Yes. Yeah, kind of like in line with the body, I guess.
Parallel to the ground?
Yes. But in Chakisaurus, the anterior of the tail, the front, is positioned differently from the back or the posterior of the tail. And this suggests that the base of the tail curved downward. It had what's known as a protonic posture. And that's something that we'd only seen in titanosaurs before.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a tail dragging situation.
Almost.
But not quite.
Not quite. So it seems that it had a muscular tail, which might have helped it sprint because its tail muscles would help with the legs moving. And the author said it was, quote, capable of providing a great force to the power stroke of the hind limbs.
Mm-hmm. It's the caudofemoralis for you.
Mm-hmm. So that's cool. The humerus, or the upper arm bone, was similar with other medium-sized elasmarians, which were more slender. Larger elasmarians, though, they have more robust characteristics in the arms and shoulders, which could be related to them later walking on all fours and moving slower. They got bigger, heavier, and slower, and their humerus was more similar to large ornithopods like Iguanodon. Chakisaurus lived in the late Cretaceous. It was found in the Erfurt Formation in Argentina. It's the first ornithischian species that's been named and described from that formation. In Patagonia, as the authors put it, quote, ornithischians are overshadowed by sauropod diversity, end quote.
That's for sure.
Yes. But there still have been a lot of ornithopods found. The type species is Chakisaurus nekul. The genus name means elder guanaco lizard. And the word Chaki comes from elder guanaco in the Aeonic language. And the guanaco is an animal that's closely related to the llama, and that's native to South America. The species name nekul means swift in the Mapudungun language. There have been 4 specimens found of this new ornithopod, and 2 are juveniles. The authors did histology on them, and they found that all the individuals were still growing, and growth marks show that they grew fast with periodic interruptions. The holotype's an incomplete individual with vertebrae, parts of the legs, 2 toe bones, and a partial sacrum. And other bones found include parts of the arms and legs, more vertebrae, partial ribs, another toe, and a toe claw. So it's a pretty good find. It's considered to be medium size for an ornithopod, and it's similar in size and proportions to a close relative, Anabisetia, which was about 6.5 feet or 2 meters long. Chakisaurus lived alongside fish, turtles, and crocodiles, as well as dinosaurs like sauropods, of course, being from that area, like the very large Argentinosaurus, and theropods like Qualicho and Mapusaurus and Meraxes. A lot going on in that area.
So it was only 6.5 or 2 meters long?
That is an estimate based on Anabisetia. Anabisetia is about 6.5 or 2 meters long.
Okay. Yeah, it looks pretty small. A single neck vertebra is about 3 centimeters or just a little over an inch long, which is sort of similar in scale to us, you might say, which is not really big enough, right? When you're talking about hanging out with Gualicho and some of these larger predatory dinosaurs, not to mention big titanosaurs clomping around and stuff. It's risky being that small.
Maybe it could hide.
That's true. Maybe they had evolved to be smaller as an advantage to hide from big stuff like you're saying. So now I'm going to get into this really cool toothless enantiornithine, which I think might be even cooler than that ornithopod.
Biased. This is the one you looked into.
I was reading a lot about it and about enantiornithines in general. I should mention this paper was published in Cretaceous Research by Xiaoli Wang and others, and they call it the first edentulous enantiornithine from the Lower Cretaceous Jehol avifauna.
So, toothless?
Yep, and from the Jehol biota in the early Cretaceous. But they put enantiornithine in the title, and I just recently learned that there is a group of paleontologists that hate the word enantiornithine and enantiornithines.
Why?
It's very strange. So the group of enantiornithines is technically officially called enantiornithes. So there's no IN in it. It's just thes, not thenes. And the group enantiornithes with a capital E was named back in 1981. So that's the official clade that includes all of these interesting bird dinosaurs. However, lots of people use the word enantiornithines with the IN in the middle and also with a lowercase e, including most experts on the group in peer-reviewed literature. This new paper uses the word enantiornithines about 100 times compared to just 3 uses of enantiornithes with a capital E and no IN. And that's because they can use enantiornithines as an adjective or as a common noun, which is just so much easier to write with. And you can jump back and forth between singular and plural really easily, and it's just a much more enjoyable way to write than restructuring everything around proper nouns, because you usually have to say something like, this member of the enantiornithes, which is just really awkward sounding. And I think that's why I caught on, because enantiornithine can be used as an adjective. "-ine" is a suffix which is often used to turn a noun into an adjective, but it is an atypical choice for turning a bird group into an adjective. Typically, the adjective form of enantiornithes would have been enantiornithian or an antiornith.
Oh, like dinosaurian?
Yes, exactly. And there have been a couple points where people pointed this out and then refused to use enantiornithine in their own paper. But even in peer-reviewed papers, the terms enantiornithine or enantiornith are rarely used, let alone when people are just casually talking about it. The first use I can find of enantiornithine came just 2 years after the name enantiornithes was coined. So almost immediately, people started saying enantiornithine.
Mm-hmm.
It's in a book by Larry Martin and others in 1983. And enantiornithine is used as an adjective in that book when they say things like the single known enantiornithine jaw.
I guess it just sounds nicer. It rolls off the tongue more.
It's much more succinct because the way to say that using enantiornithes would be the single jaw known to the group, the enantiornithes, or something like that, which is just way more clunky. So often with taxonomic names, they get shortened or back-formed, as it's called, into an adjective. They can also be clipped into another noun. For example, the group Theropoda, with a capital T and an A at the end, is usually shortened to just theropod. As an adjective, you can say a theropod footprint, although technically you should probably say a theropodin footprint. And as a common noun, you can say things like theropods have been common since the late Triassic, whereas you can't really make a plural version of theropoda easily. Or you could say the theropoda has been common. It sounds strange when you try to use the proper noun sometimes. The first journal use of the back-formed enantiornith I can find for the record was in 1996, which was 13 years after the first use of enantiornithine. And by that point, the word enantiornithine had been used in dozens of papers.
So, it already caught on.
Yeah, it was. I think the race was already over by 96. And then the clunkier enantiornithine took even longer to show up. The first use of that I could find is 2006, another 10 years later. In that paper, they even make a point of like, we're using enantiornithine because this is the word people should be using. But the cat was way out of the bag by that point. And I will point out a large majority of experts still use enantiornithine for the adjective, even though it doesn't agree with the typical way to make an adjective from a bird group. And at some point, even though the adjective wasn't made the standard way, it becomes the correct usage.
That's how language works.
Exactly. So I still see people sort of arguing about this, but I think when all the experts are using the word, I could only find one use of an adjective other than enantiornithine in the last 2 years. So I think it's settled. We're using enantiornithine. It kind of makes it sound like there's a group enantiornithines, which is the main complaint about it, when it's really enantiornithes, but whatever, it's fine. "-ine" as a suffix is really common. For example, there's equine instead of equus for horse, and usually it means something more of a broad category than a cladistic type thing, but I think it works. But anyway, that's all just an aside, because I stumbled into that again while I was researching this dinosaur, and I was like, should I try to avoid saying enantiornithines? So I dug through and found, no, we're just going to keep using enantiornithine because that's what everybody says, and I think it's fine. So as Sabrina mentioned in a recent episode, enantiornithes means opposite birds, and that's because they have an opposite shoulder to modern birds. Specifically, their scapula is concave, where it attaches to the coracoid. And in modern birds, the scapula is convex in the same place. So it's sort of reverse, bulging out versus bulging in their shoulder.
The opposite.
Yes, one might say. It was kind of funny, too, because in the original description of enantiornithes, he didn't say what was opposite about them. So people were guessing. They're like, maybe they're opposite because the toes and legs sort of form in an opposite way. But that's not the case. If you dig into it, you can sort of piece together he probably meant the shoulder. The new dinosaur can be easily identified as a member of the group Enantiornithes. Okay, I'm going to go back to enantiornithine. This new dinosaur has a strong and long pygostyle for attaching tail feathers, typical of enantiornithines. But atypically, it doesn't have teeth. Until now, we've usually described enantiornithines as a group of birds with teeth, even though there are exactly 2 later enantiornithines that didn't have teeth.
Yeah, they're the opposite birds. Nothing to do with teeth.
Exactly. But that makes them a little bit more like birds in a way.
Oh, yeah, not having teeth.
Yeah.
But I was thinking because the description of what makes them an enantiornithine has nothing to do with whether or not they have teeth.
Yeah, we know that now. It would have been funny if one of the people trying to figure out why he said enantiornithes was like, maybe it's because they have teeth, and that's the opposite of birds that don't have teeth. Fortunately, that's not what we went with. I'm not sure how we're going to just generally characterize enantiornithines now, because usually we say they're the birds with teeth. Maybe we're going to have to say the birds with concave scapulae, but I don't think so.
It's harder to picture.
Yeah. I think maybe a better thing is to focus on the fact that they're super precocial. That's an actual term that is used scientifically, meaning that they're essentially able to fly immediately after hatching, which is pretty cool. The new enantiornithine is named Imparavis attenboroughi, and the meaning of Imparavis is, quote, in Latin, impar, meaning odd, and avis, meaning bird, referring to the bird's toothless condition and atypical forelimb morphologies, end quote.
It's the odd bird, opposite bird.
Yep. But some of the things that are odd about it are odd because it's like a bird when it's supposed to be an opposite bird.
I feel like we're going in circles.
It's a
little
double
bit.
negative. It's becoming more normal of a bird. And then Attenboroughi is, quote, in honor of Sir David Attenborough for his influential work in presenting natural history to the general public and his far-reaching advocacy of extant wildlife conservation, end quote. So when you put it together, you get Attenborough's odd bird.
Attenborough's odd bird, opposite bird. That's how I like to think of it.
Attenborough had a response to it. He said, quote, it is a great honor to have one's name attached to a fossil, particularly one as spectacular and important as this. It seems the history of birds is more complex than we knew, end quote.
Nice.
It's a good quote. And I agree that the honor is well-deserved because he is amazing. One of the co-authors said basically they wouldn't have gotten into any sort of natural sciences if it wasn't for David Attenborough.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, it's very sweet. The odd bird, Imparavis, was found near Tuodao Yingzi village in Liaoning, China. And that's in northeast China, like most enantiornithine bird finds. It was found in the Jiufotang Formation, which is from the early Cretaceous, about 120 million years ago. And the other toothless enantiornithines were found about 48 million years later. That's Euornis and Gobiteryx. So Imparavis is actually the first early Cretaceous toothless enantiornithine, and from that date you can tell it almost predates the other toothless enantiornithines by as much as non-avian dinosaurs predate us in the fossil record, meaning when they went extinct to today.
It's a lot of time for toothlessness.
It is. Yeah, it's a huge pushback in terms of when the first enantiornithines lost their teeth. They also did X-ray scans to double check for teeth, and they still couldn't find any. So they're quite confident that Imparavis did not have any teeth.
No teeth waiting to rupture.
Yep. Imparavis is not quite as old as Eoconfuciusornis, so we can't say it's like the earliest toothless avialin or something like that, because Eoconfuciusornis was maybe about 10 million years earlier. But Eoconfuciusornis isn't an enantiornithine. It's in a different group. So that's why it's the oldest enantiornithine we know that didn't have teeth. Like most Chinese birds, it was found beautifully preserved in a slab with a nearly complete skeleton. The only things that are missing are some vertebrae and gastralia, aka belly ribs. And the skull is a little bit smashed, which often happens in these slabs. It's sort of the double-edged sword of the amazing preservation with all the bones, is that they tend to be smushed really flat. So you lose some of the 3D reconstruction.
When I think of fossils in slabs, I think of how sometimes people will press flowers.
Yeah, it is a lot like that. And after it's pressed, you don't really know what the shape of the flower was, although you can get a lot of detail from it. Just in a flattened 2D detail you get out of it, which is another reason that they X-rayed it, because it was a little bit hard to see some of the skull bones since they're all smashed on top of each other. They describe Imparavis as quote-unquote thrush-sized. And if you're not familiar, thrushes are birds, and they're roughly 20 centimeters, or about 8 inches long, plus or minus a few inches, or 10-ish centimeters. And they usually weigh a couple of ounces or less than 100 grams.
They think that this enantiornithine weighed the same?
They said it was thrush-sized. They didn't say whether they meant by wingspan, by height, or by weight, but I just am telling you what the thrush size is. So you could interpret it as you will. Since it is a pretty bird-like dinosaur, I think both the height/length and the weight are probably in the same ballpark. It might not be quite as lightweight, but I think the length is probably about right. So under a foot long, I would say. One cool thing about it is it's basically printed to scale in the journal, taking up about a quarter of the page when it's scrunched up. That's how small it is. Based on Imparavis, they now think Chiapiavis, which was found in the same formation, was probably also toothless. That one was a little bit less well preserved, so they couldn't really tell for sure if it had teeth or not. But now that they have this Imparavis to work with,
you can do more comparisons.
Yeah.
It also makes sense that there's more enantiornithines that were toothless.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you never know for sure if those two that were 40 million years later were closely related and shared a common ancestor that was toothless or not. But if they did, you'd expect to find toothless ones going farther back in time. Interestingly, the other toothless enantiornithines have curvature on their upper and or lower jaws, whereas Imparavis has very straight jaws, which means when it closes its mouth, even without any potential keratin on its mouth, the top and bottom jaws basically touch and don't leave any gaps, whereas the other ones would have to have some keratin to fill in those gaps, as do many modern birds, and things like hadrosaurs. They have to have keratin covering on their beak in order to occlude, is the technical term for contacting when they close their mouth. Comparing to similar jaws in modern birds, Imparavis was probably, quote, capable of picking and handling fruits, foraging for invertebrates in and under ground cover, and picking apart decaying wood debris to access developing invertebrates, end quote.
That's a lot of picking and foraging.
Yeah, so basically they think that based on those jaws, which come together really well at the front of the mouth, if you compare them to modern birds that have that same sort of mouth, that's the sort of thing that they do. They do a lot of picking through stuff on forest floors kind of thing.
That's interesting because it doesn't sound too different from what birds today do.
Yeah. And I guess that is sort of circular because it's like, well, we're looking at birds today that have these types of jaws and what they do and extrapolating that to this dinosaur. So if they had any sort of different behavior with their jaws, we'll never be able to figure it out by comparing to modern birds. But it is useful that we have modern birds that have similar jaws so we can actually do a one-to-one comparison for once. Because usually when we're talking about dinosaurs, it's like, we don't have anything today that's much like them. So how are you going to know what they did?
Except for the really bird-like dinosaurs.
Exactly. They did say, though, there could be other factors in terms of why their jaws and their beak looked the way it did. For example, sexual selection. There's also vocalization. Different sounds require different mouth shapes. There's thermoregulation advantages to different mouth shapes. And there's also preening, or tending to their feathers. A lot of birds have special adaptations in their bill for that. So we really don't know why it had a bill the way it did, but that's our best guess based on modern birds. Another toothless enantiornithine, Gobiteryx, came out as a very close relative to Imparavis, despite being almost 50 million years later in the fossil record. There's probably a lot of missing fossils in between.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
I might have buried the lead a little bit with Imparavis because maybe the coolest thing about it is that it seemed to have extremely strong wings. Actually, the researchers who were talking about why they picked this one out to do research on it, it wasn't because of the toothless beak. It was because it seemed to have this big old muscle attachment point on its arm, which they thought might mean that it could flap its wings really strongly. And they determined that it could probably both flap its wings rapidly as well as powerfully to take off from the ground. They described it as near vertically.
Wow. That is burying the lead. I don't know what's bigger news. Not having teeth or being a really strong flyer.
Yeah, it's really cool. And when they were comparing that aspect of it, the ability to sort of take off vertically, they think that it might be an escape mechanism That's what a lot of birds today have, that sort of really powerful flight stroke for, and combined with the way that their feet don't look like they were great for perching and stuff like that. Like they probably spent a lot of time on the forest floor.
And when you're that small, you got to be able to escape quickly.
Yes. So their summary of how it would have behaved is, quote, together with the morphology of the hind limb, we suggest Imparavis was primarily a terrestrial forager that could utilize sudden bursts of flight to escape into arboreal settings as a prey evasion strategy, end quote.
Nice. Well done, odd bird.
Yeah, it's really cool. Its toothlessness, the fact that its jaws are sort of unique among the toothless enantiornithines, as well as the really powerful wings, and just how early it was toothless. It's really cool. I'm going to talk more about toothlessness in the fun fact, but it sort of inspired me because it's very cool.
Well, we will get there after a few more exciting news items, including a nearly complete titanosaur that was recently found. But first, we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. Switching gears a little bit, I wonder if I went through all our episodes, how many of the episodes I've mentioned or I've managed to squeeze in something about sauropods.
I think most.
Yeah. Well done, me.
A lot more than I sneak in ankylosaurs, but there's a lot more sauropods than there are ankylosaurs.
A lot more to say, way cooler.
Not cool.
So this story is, there was a man who was walking his dog and he found this nearly complete 70 million year old titanosaur.
Oh, wow. Nearly complete.
Yeah. 70% complete, they found. It's a titanosaur estimated to be about 30 feet or 9 meters long.
That's a little guy.
Yeah.
After talking about like a 100-gram dinosaur. It's like 5 inches long.
Yep, this one's just a little bigger than that. It's Damien Baschetto who found the fossils in France. He found them actually about 2 years ago and then reported it to paleontologists so they could dig it up. But they kind of kept it all a secret for the last 2 years because they wanted to make sure to protect the fossils while they were digging it up.
Makes sense.
The reason he was able to find it is because there was a landslide that exposed the bones on a cliff.
That'll do it.
Yeah. Now, eventually, the Titanosaur is going to go on display at the Creuzy Museum in France, which is near where the fossils were found. And Damien's now going for a master's in paleontology, and he's been volunteering at the museum, all because of this find.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. Don't hear too many stories like that with ankylosaurs.
And they keep just running into them in like quarries after they already blew them up.
There are some cool finds that way, though.
Yeah.
And like we always say, a lot of time, even if it's not the most ideal way to find a dinosaur, it was likely we'd never find the dinosaur if these things weren't happening.
Very true.
Actually, that ties in very nicely to my next story, which is about the opalized fossils in Australia, specifically in Lightning Ridge, and how they took their sweet time to opalize.
Yeah, opal takes a long time to form, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. So this paper, if you want to get deep, they go very deep. It was published in Minerals as open access by George Musto and Elizabeth Smith. And I'll start with a quick history of opals in Lightning Ridge, Australia, which is why it ties in nicely to what we were just saying. Opal mining began around 1887 when black opal was discovered north of Walgett. If Walgett sounds familiar, we recently talked about Walgetosuchus as a dinosaur of the day, which was named, it's an opalized dinosaur, named because it was found near that town. And then opal mining really grew by 1903.
So it was going pretty early. I think 1903 was around the time Walgetosuchus was named, if I remember right. I remember it being very early 1900s and being surprised.
Well, 1932 for Walgetosuchus, but
I was way off.
The bones were discovered in 1905. That might be what you're thinking of.
Oh, could be. Thanks for being generous with that.
Anyway, for the first decades, the mining was done by candlelight or lamplight with a pick and a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and windlass, which is used to move heavy things. So it was a slow process to mine. And then things got faster in the 1960s with new machinery to extract and process the opal. Lightning Ridge, of course, is famous for its precious black opal, though there are other types of opal found there. There's crystal or translucent, white, gray, potch, which is the non-precious opal, and more. And we got to see a bunch of those when we visited.
We sure did.
The author said, quote, over time, prospecting and excavation principles have remained unchanged, and opal mining is basically a small-scale, localized, non-corporate activity, end quote.
Yeah, there's some similar mining that goes on in Africa for precious stones, where basically the main way it's done is people digging a hole in the ground, climbing into the hole, and sort of doing it solo.
Wow. So a very small and manual process.
Yeah. It's not like mining out gold where you find the seam and you make this huge mine and you can just follow that seam for a long distance, because the seams are way more sporadic and they're not even really seams. A lot of times they're just little pockets here and there.
Well, the fossils have been found as a byproduct of mining, which is why I thought it was a good tie-in there, or a good segue. So yeah, mining is important for paleontology, but mining also affects what we know about the fossils found. For example, these fossils, they're not usually found in situ. Instead, they're in tailings, which is, quote, the residue from machine washing, which breaks up articulated and associated specimens, end quote.
Also known as just the waste pile.
So there's pros and cons to this, but if it weren't for mining, we probably wouldn't be finding these fossils. In the early years, fossil finds in Lightning Ridge didn't get much attention, and the opal was valued so much that a lot of fossils were cut into gemstones.
No.
Yes, which the author said is, quote, a practice that continues even today.
I don't like that.
Maybe less so today, though, because we keep hearing about dinosaurs.
Yeah. It really seems like a nice opalized fossil should be worth way more as a fossil than it should be as a gemstone. Just like with amber, right? If you have amber and you have an animal preserved in this, you don't cut it in half and like destroy the animal inside it, because the fact that it's preserving this really cool ancient animal is way more interesting and valuable, at least in amber, than it is when it's cut into pieces and completely unrecognizable.
To us science folk, yeah.
Yeah, well, but even for non-science folk, when it comes to amber, guess opal's different.
It started pretty early because in terms of finding and saving the fossils, the earliest report of vertebrate fossils were from 1909, and they were sent to the British Museum. Originally, those fossils were thought to belong to a megalosaur.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise.
Because everything was thought to belong to a megalosaur.
Yeah, for a good long time. But then Friedrich von Huene studied them in 1932 and found them as 3 new theropod species. There's Walgetosuchus, Rapator, and Fulgurotherium.
One of these is not like the others. Definitely a mammal name going on there.
So some of the fossils have been with the Australian Museum in Sydney since 1912, also pretty early on. And there's other dinosaurs that have since been found. They include Weewarrasaurus and Fostoria. Those are some of the more recent ones we've talked about on our show. Lightning Ridge fossils became famous in the early 1980s with mammals Steropodon and Chalicodon when they were discovered. And there are a lot of opalized fossils that have been found. Teeth, bones, osteoderms. Opalized fossils have been found of fish, mollusks, turtles, plesiosaurs, crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, of course, birds, and mammals, as well as trace fossils or ichnofossils. I didn't realize that there were opalized trace fossils until I read this paper. Yeah.
I was going to say, oh, look, there's ankylosaurs because there's osteoderms, but then you said there's crocodiles and turtles, which also have osteoderms. So.
I can't remember specifically about, ankylosaur osteoderms from when we visited.
Yeah, and it's not always easy to tell what kind of species an osteoderm came from just by looking at the armor.
These opal fossils, though, they do tell us a lot because they're, quote, usually perfect 3D casts, replicas, undistorted by compression or diagenesis, exhibiting variable degrees of pre-burial weathering, end quote. So they're in very good condition. And also, in, quote, translucent specimens, fine anatomical details such as nutrient and nerve canals may be visible inside the bone, end quote.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, I had no idea.
I always think of it like it gets buried, it decays, and it's replaced by opal basically in that place. And there's very little details left about the original bone other than the exterior shape. But that's really cool to hear that sometimes it's replaced in a way where it preserves a lot of that intricate detail inside.
Yeah, and the fact that it's translucent, you don't even need any special equipment to see that.
Yeah, it reminds me of like a plastic model of a heart or something that you see at a doctor's office where you can see through it and see like the ventricles or whatever. But it just happened like that in nature. That's super awesome.
It is. So going back to the trace fossils, they have found coprolites and burrows. And in the paper, the authors examined 2 examples of coprolites that were thought to be plant fossils because they do contain plant fragments, but nope, they're poop. And they probably came from herbivores because of the plant fragments. And herbivore coprolites are much less common compared to carnivore coprolite finds.
That's true. Yeah, we've talked about that. Although if it's fully opalized, you probably can't do much of a chemical analysis on it, so it might not be quite as useful. Although you did say they could tell that there were leaves, so you might be able to, if you're really skilled, tell what kind of leaf it is by the shape of the leaf.
Maybe. This first example, though, it's pretty small, and based on the size, they think it came from a small animal, and it's also in a spiral shape, which is similar to coprolites produced by lungfish.
Sounds like an emoji.
It does. There's been a lot of vertical burrow casts found, too, and they're typically filled with potch, the common opal. They think those are possibly made by worms. And a lot of plants have been opalized, too. They include cones and seeds. The most common ones are twigs, stems, and wood fragments. And they often have this hollow box structure where material decomposed after the initial opal filling of the mold.
That's interesting. So it forms the opal from the outside in, but then it basically decomposes before it can form all the way in. So you end up with a hollow structure.
Yeah, it's interesting that happened with a lot of the plants. So the team looked into when fossils started opalizing in the area. Like, did it happen in the late Cretaceous, the mid-Cenozoic, or was it even more recently? They also want to know, did it happen shortly after the material, like the bones were deposited, or did it take longer? How did it happen? Were microbes a part of it? They studied fossils from Lightning Ridge as well as other opal sites that were similar to Lightning Ridge to compare it to. In Australia, most commercial opal deposits are within the Great Artesian Basin, the GAB, which had a large inland sea in the early Cretaceous. And the GAB, quote, records the transgression and regression of the epicontinental Eromanga Sea, end quote, which got me thinking, Eromanga wasn't always the furthest town from the sea.
Yeah, that's like their tagline.
Yeah.
It used to be part of the sea.
Not in the early Cretaceous. Anyway, the area in Australia also has a lot of volcaniclastic material, products of volcanic rocks. So the authors compared opal deposits in places like Slovakia and Spain, and they also looked at opal in Nevada in the US, because there's Miocene deposits in the Virgin Valley. And opal mining started in Nevada in 1907, and several of the largest mines have been there and active for more than a century. So Nevada actually had the best model to compare to Australia, and I didn't even realize there was opal mining in Nevada. I knew about silver mining, didn't know about opal mining.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we often talk about how the west coast of North America has a lot in common with the east coast of Australia. And this is just like another, you go a little bit farther inland from the east coast of Australia, you go a little bit farther inland from the west coast of North America, and there's more similarities.
Yeah, so between these two sites, there's a lot of similarities with the formation of sedimentary opal. Both regions are now arid, but when the fossils were deposited, they both had more mild, wetter climates. They also both had volcanism. There are some differences. Nevada has mineralized tissue in the plant fossils, whereas Australian fossils are only casts. And also in Nevada, there's precious opal only with mineralized wood. The authors found evidence for delayed opalization. In other words, opalizing could be a very slow process. Because they found that the opalization of mid-Cretaceous plants and animals likely happened in the Neogene, which spans from about 23 million years to 2.5 million years ago.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Much later than after they were deposited.
Yeah, I'm used to it being like millions of years, like single-digit millions of years, but that's talking about like 100 million years.
Yeah. That's why I said they took their sweet time to opalize.
Yeah, really.
That's based on the minerals of the area in Australia. They found opalization didn't happen in the Cretaceous, and it didn't happen that recently either. So it's probably not related to microbes because fossil microbes have been found in some specimens, but they're not as they put it, universal characteristic. And also in the other locations they looked at, the same kind of opal is from the Neogene. So it seems that early Cretaceous organisms were buried in these clay-rich sediments, then they eventually decomposed and produced molds that were later filled in and opalized, but much, much later in the Neogene. They think the delay came from several factors. Some of them include how long it took for the material to degrade, which is based on elements in the soil and temperature and pH and more, and they have no direct relationship to how long something's been buried. And then when opal entered into the molds, the cast fossils, that kind of depended on the consistency of the clay and the ability for the fluids to make their way in. When the silica-bearing fluids made their way in, that might be related to tectonic activity in the Neogene. There's a lot of folding and faulting and fracturing, so they just needed that tectonic activity, those earthquakes, to get things going.
Interesting. So when they say decay, I think most people like me imagine it's like rotting away like in compost. But really in this case, the decay we're talking about is more like there's a rock there, like limestone, and it's being etched away by acidic water getting in, and that's decaying it, because there's no way 100 million years after this bone got buried, it's still just a regular bone, and then something triggers it to decay by microbes, like you were saying. It's got to be something more chemical.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's really interesting, and how I guess we shouldn't be surprised that it took a special set of factors to opalize fossils.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds like most of them are just casts, but you were saying there are some spectacular ones which are a little bit more complicated than just simple casts, so there must be something even more different going on in those cases.
Oh, because you can see the details in the translucent ones.
Yeah.
I think those still count as cast fossils, though.
But I don't know how you'd have a cast of the interior of a structure. I have to go to the new Opal Museum when it opens up. Ask him these tough questions.
Yes.
But how did it form?
So yeah, Lightning Ridge in Australia, I highly recommend if you're ever able to get over there. It's a cool place to visit and see the opalized fossils.
Yeah, they've got a dinosaur. That Fostoria's right in there.
And speaking of cool fossil sites, this next paper is about how really exceptional fossil sites, they're important, but they can influence our understanding of animals and how they developed on a global scale, which is interesting when you think about how localized that one site is. This was also an open access paper published in PLOS One by C. Henrik Woolley and others. So the Gobi Desert in Mongolia is a really important site for fossils, but not necessarily for the fossils that you think they are. Like, Garrett, what do you think of when you're thinking Gobi Desert?
In terms of important fossils? Probably the little ceratopsians and velociraptor and maybe therizinosaurs.
Yeah, exactly. Velociraptor, Protoceratops. There's oviraptorosaurs and ornithomimosaurs. Lots of bird fossils. And this is something we probably didn't know because we focus on dinosaurs. There's also a lot of squamates with at least 50 described species with 3D preserved skulls and partial skeletons.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So we're getting into I know squamate rather than I know dino?
We're talking about fossil sites.
Okay.
Because all of these squamates make it a really exceptional fossil site, which is known as a lagerstätten. But it's not a typical one. It has not only really complete skeletons, but there's also a lot of diversity of species, in this case, lizards, squamates. And the authors were saying, like, maybe it should get a superlative, like a super lagerstätten.
Just to be pedantic, the singular, I think, is lagerstätte.
Oh.
And then the plural would be statten, but maybe not. I might have it reversed.
I don't know.
I'll check that in post.
Okay.
So if you hear it, I was right. Otherwise, it won't even exist.
Great. So most lagerstätten sites, they're more narrow in focus. Like there's a lot of fossils, more than are usually found together, or they preserve soft tissues and organisms that rarely fossilize. And that makes these sites important. But the question the authors were looking at is like, how much did these sites influence our understanding of biodiversity and evolution? So the team looked at publications of over 1,300 species, if you want the exact number, 1,327 species of non-avian theropod dinosaurs, Mesozoic birds, and fossil squamates. So, well, earlier I said lizards, but it's lizards, snakes, and mosasaurs
Oh, that's right.
from around the world.
Yeah, I love that tidbit that mosasaurs are more closely related to snakes than they are to dinosaurs.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
So they looked at all these species and then they compared the influence of lagerstätten deposits on this phylogenetic information.
Oh, I see. So if you didn't have these amazing sites, what we still be able to tell about
Yes.
the world of squamates?
Well, not just squamates, but yes. They said, quote, although the incompleteness of fossil data is a long-established reality in paleobiology, a growing number of studies have employed a variety of novel metrics to characterize and quantify fossil record biases in organismal groups. Combined with an increasing number of sampling proxies to account for a multitude of biases in paleobiological data, we are equipped with an advanced toolkit to explore outstanding questions related to biodiversity in the fossil record. However, the association between fossil record incompleteness and our ability to infer evolutionary relationships of fossil organisms remains a pressing but underexplored question, end quote.
That was a lot.
Yes. I think the gist, though, is we've got these amazing sites, but they might have biased us in terms of looking at the global picture.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's not so much that they help fill in way more than we would have without them. They might actually just bias us a ton so that we're too focused on the lagerstätte in terms of if you're looking at the overall evolutionary tree, it's all super detailed in one spot, and then there's a lot of...
Yeah, and then because we know the details of one spot, we might extract that information and infer, well, it must have been like that in other spots, when really we don't know for sure.
Interesting.
So that's what they're saying. It's the lagerstätten effect, and you have to take that into consideration.
This is just another factor in sampling bias and preservation bias, in addition to the fact that animals in certain environments preserve better. There's if you get an environment where tons of things preserve in a very specific place, that can also mess with your data.
Yes. So you can learn a lot from these sites. These sites are still very important, but just be aware that they might give you a bias.
Gotcha.
And yeah, again, having lots of fossils at one site will tell you a lot about one period of time in a specific area, but not necessarily give you a lot of global insights. It was interesting, though. They found that theropods have been found, a lot of them, around the world, so they're less susceptible to this lagerstätten effect. But for birds, there's the Jehol biota. It's an important site. And then the Gobi desert lizards shape our understanding of evolutionary history the most in terms of this lagerstätten effect.
Oh, that's why you brought them up.
Yep.
Because they're the worst or best example, depending on who you ask, of lagerstätte.
I think overall it's a good thing, though. It's like with anything. Once you recognize the bias, you can account for it.
That's interesting with theropods, because at first I was thinking maybe we just don't have a theropod lagerstätte, but then there are actually some. Like I think of Coelophysis down in New Mexico, where there's like hundreds of them.
The Cleveland Lloyd Quarry with the Allosaurus.
Yeah, that's probably a lagerstätte. But I guess the tricky thing is with these really large animals, you can have really good preservation in a large area, but you don't get hundreds of individuals usually like you could with squamates or trilobites or, a ton of other stuff. When you have these huge animals that are 10, 30 feet long, then all of a sudden you only get a handful of individuals.
This reminds me a little bit of the Ankylosaur and I guess Stegosaur study, because it was a study of how to classify those types of dinosaurs that we talked about. And we dove very deep into this, so this was a piece of premium content. If you want to check it out, head over to Patreon. And in the study, the author said Borealopelta was a victim of its success because it was so well preserved that it actually made it a little harder to classify.
Yeah, that's true. That's another good comparison. Anytime you're sampling stuff statistically, you want the sampling to be sort of even across the groups. And if all of a sudden one of them you have way more detail about, it's going to mess with your analysis.
Mm-hmm. So there we go, the nuances of paleontology.
Yeah.
And we'll get into our dinosaur of the day next, but first, a quick break for our sponsors. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Zanclodon, which was a request from Ellie via our Patreon and Discord. So thanks. As I said in the beginning of the episode, Zanclodon's not actually a dinosaur. It's an Archosauriform that lived in the Middle Triassic around 242 to 237 million years ago in what is now Germany. It's been found in the Erfurt Formation. But at one point, it was thought to be a theropod, and that's why we're covering it as a dinosaur of the day.
That makes sense.
Yes. But now it's considered to be an indeterminate Archosauriform.
And archosaurs, as a reminder, are the group that include not only dinosaurs, but also pterosaurs and crocodilomorphs, or suchians, pseudosuchians. So if you say it's an Archosauriform, then it could be either close to one of those, like almost a dinosaur, like a dinosaur form, or it could be in any of those groups, or it could be sharing a lot of traits that are found in all of them, and then we really have no idea, and we think that it's probably outside of all three groups.
Since it's indeterminate, and we also only know its jaw with teeth, it's hard to say what it was. Also, what it looked like exactly.
Yeah, so in the future, it could come out to be a pterosaur. That seems a little bit unlikely if it was thought to be a dinosaur at one point, or a dinosaur again, or a dinosaur form.
And the paleo art for it looks really similar to Megalosaurus, with the jaw full of sharp teeth and walking on two legs. So based on the jaw with teeth, it's thought to be a large predatory archosaur.
Interesting that they think it was large, being from the Middle Triassic, because there weren't very large dinosaurs then in general. Maybe it was large for its time.
Yeah. Large for an archosaur?
Yeah. A Middle Triassic archosaur.
The fossil found is a maxilla, a jawbone with teeth again, and that was found in the Geldorf alum mine.
Okay. So it's the upper jawbone. Or lower snout is sometimes how I talk about the maxilla.
So specifically, it was a left maxilla with 5 slightly recurved teeth.
That is sort of Megalosaurus-like.
Yeah. There have been other fossils attributed to Zanclodon by the person who named Zanclodon, but they've since been lost. There was one other fossil assigned to Zanclodon, a loose germ tooth, and that means a tooth that was forming.
Okay. So germ-like as in a spore, not a germ-like something that you get infected by.
Yes. Like germinating an idea, kind of. You're germinating a tooth. Zanclodon's teeth are not serrated, and that's considered to be its unique feature. For a while, Zanclodon was a wastebasket taxon, so it's got that in common with Megalosaurus.
Yeah.
But now the type and only species is Zanclodon laevis. The genus name means scythe tooth or sickle tooth. Originally, it was named Smilodon in 1846.
Wow. So it's a very old discovery.
Yes. But Smilodon was already being used for the saber-toothed cat, so it got a replacement name in 1847, Zanclodon. A lot of species were thought to be Zanclodon. Like I said, it was a wastebasket taxon. It was up to at least 7, but those species are now either considered to be a nomum dubium or junior synonyms to Zanclodon laevis, or they're now classified as different species.
In different genera?
Yes. One of those was Zanclodon plieningeri. The person who named Zanclodon, well, Smilodon, then Zanclodon, was Plieninger. And that species was named in 1896 by Frost, but it turned out that it was based on that same loose germ tooth that now is attributed to Zanclodon. So it's considered to be a junior synonym of Zanclodon laevis.
And it was just named based on a tooth anyway, so.
Not even a full tooth, a germ tooth.
Yeah, get out of here.
Some other examples include Zanclodon bavaricus was named in 1894, but now that's thought to be some sort of sauropod. And Zanclodon schuttzii, named in 1900, that's now thought to be a carnivorous archosaur named Batrachotomus.
That's interesting. So it was named based on this long dagger-like tooth, or I guess scythe-like tooth after dagger tooth was taken. And then every big, impressive tooth they were finding for a little bit, a group of people would say, throw it in with Zanclodon, because that's the one that has the big sickly teeth.
Just like Megalosaurus.
Yeah.
And also like Megalosaurus, it's gone through many classifications. There's some bones that were referred to Zanclodon, but they turned out to be from Plateosaurus.
Weird.
Yeah, that late Triassic sauropodomorph with the long neck and long tail that walked on two legs. And Marsh, O.C. Marsh, was one of the scientists who said that they were the same. He said that both in 1895 and 1896. But we all know Marsh wasn't always right. Zanclodon has also been considered to be a theropod by various scientists in the 1800s and early 1900s, as a plesiosaur in 1911 and 1913, as a carnosaur in 1923, and as a prosauropod in 1939. And then at different times throughout the 1800s and 1900s, it's been thought to be a megalosaur. There's one species, Zanclodon cambrensis, that was named based on a jaw that's similar to Megalosaurus, but now that jaw is considered to belong to a megalosaurid theropod. In 1956, Romer synonymized Zanclodon with Pterotosaurus, a carnivorous archosaur that walked on four legs and it had a robust head and a long tail.
A quadrupedal. Oh, it's an archosaur.
Yes.
Not a dinosaur. I was thinking it was a quadrupedal carnivorous dinosaur for a second. And I was like, whoa, that's interesting.
Well, archosaurs are interesting.
They are. But there are a lot of quadrupedal archosaurs.
Yes.
That are carnivorous.
And then some scientists have considered Zanclodon to be a novum dubium. But in 2011, Rainer Schach found Zanclodon to be valid and to be an indeterminate archosaur, and said that we need more fossils to better classify it in the future.
It's a cool name, so I'm glad that it hasn't just been thrown away completely.
Yeah. Went from wastebasket taxon to almost not being valid to, all right, it's valid, but we need more fossils.
Yeah.
Some other animals that lived around the same time and place as Zanclodon include reptiles like the archosaur Batrachotomus. That's the one I mentioned earlier. It's got a long head and a long tail and walked on all fours. Then there's Nothosaurus, a semi-oceanic animal that may have lived like a seal. And that's just to name a few of those reptiles.
I was just talking about Nothosaurus in our Spinosaurus swimming update episode, because that was one that had less dense bones than Spinosaurus.
Oh, yeah.
But is unequivocally semi-aquatic. Somebody in Discord helpfully corrected me that it's semi-aquatic, not fully aquatic, because it's seal-like. So probably spent some time on land.
Yeah, it's hard to be a fully aquatic animal.
One that breathes air for sure, especially if you lay hard-shelled eggs or something.
Yeah. But yeah, and then some other animals included amphibians and fish. Some more semi-aquatic and aquatic animals.
And our fun fact of the day is that the first dinosaurs all had teeth, but many later species of dinosaurs had lost them completely. However, it's not just a simple trend towards toothlessness, even in birds and other groups that are famous for not having teeth.
It's never a simple trend.
No, evolution is always really complicated, no matter what the topic is. So if you're thinking about dinosaurs losing teeth and you're really into the subject, the one that might come to mind is the small theropod Lemusaurus. That's a dinosaur that lost its teeth in favor of a toothless beak as it grew up. So an individual Lemusaurus as a baby would have teeth and a more normal looking snout. And then as an adult, it wouldn't have any teeth left and it would have a beak. That's very much one of those ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny situations where as it grows up, you can almost see the evolution happening. But in this case, I'm not talking about Lemusaurus. I'm talking about lineages of dinosaurs that lost their teeth. So some dinosaur groups lost their teeth over evolutionary history, including many theropods. One of them is the noasaurid Berthosaura. Lemusaurus is also a noasaurid.
Except Berthosaura was born without teeth and Lemusaurus was born with teeth.
Yes, presumably. We don't have a Berthosaurus really young individual, or I should say neonate or, perinate.
Hatchling.
Yeah, hatchling. But we do have a juvenile Berthosaur. I think the holotype is actually a juvenile. So unlike Lemusaurus, Berthosaura might have been toothless its whole life. And interestingly, for the record, Lemusaurus was in the late Jurassic, whereas Berthosaura lived in the early Cretaceous. So in this case, they are getting more toothless over time. But to throw a monkey wrench in that, noasaurids also include one of the toothiest little dinosaurs I've ever seen, which is Chakisaurus. Chakisaurus, you might recognize if you saw it. It's fossilized with the teeth in its lower jaw pointing forwards out of its mouth, sort of like that shark Helicoprion. So it's literally looks like its bottom jaw is sort of bent down and forwards, and that the teeth are poking out like a massive underbite, almost like a crocodile cartoon or something, some sort of monster movie situation.
Unless you're watching Prehistoric Planet.
Yeah, in Prehistoric Planet 2, they interpreted that as a taphonomy effect, so a change that happened after it died, that basically, as it was fossilizing or after it got buried, that bone got sort of bent over time. But when it was alive, they thought that it was actually just a straight, normal lower jaw, essentially. So they have it with pretty normal looking jaws in the show, although it does still have pretty big teeth. If you're trying to remember which one it was, it's the one that they show eating crabs and later getting eaten by a giant snake.
No.
That's Chakisaurus. And one of the juveniles gets eaten by a Beelzebufo, the giant toad.
Gives you an idea of how small it was.
Yes. So yeah, Chakisaurus was in the late Cretaceous. It was one of the last Noasaurids, and it had a lot of teeth. So even within Noasaurids, you've got partially toothless, and then tons of crazy teeth. With birds, early birds like Archaeopteryx or Anchiornis had teeth, but out of 10,000 plus birds around today, none of them have teeth.
I'm glad about that.
Well, if you look up close at some bird mouths, some of them do have really spiky bills and or tongues and or roofs of their mouths that can look pretty terrifying. In fact, some of them are so spiky that I would say they make cat tongues look like fleece blankets.
The sandpaper-like cat tongues.
Yeah, because they have just huge spikes that you can see from a distance on some of them, especially the ones that eat fish, because it's basically like they use their tongue like teeth or like spears, essentially, to grab onto the fish. And then sometimes the roof of their mouth has it too, to sort of make sure the fish don't try to escape out of their mouth while they're eating them.
That's not fun for the fish.
No. I think getting eaten in any case would be not fun, but getting stabbed extra on the way in probably isn't great. But with birds, again, they didn't simply trend towards toothlessness. There was a study by Brocklehurst and Field in 2021 that found there was, quote, no long-term selection towards toothlessness, end quote, in Mesozoic birds. Which is very surprising.
Yes.
We always think of these early birds like Anchiornis and Archaeopteryx having teeth, and then later birds resembling birds that we know today not having teeth. But instead, they say, quote, fully toothless jaws arose independently numerous times, end quote, and that it wasn't until about 90 million years ago that the ancestors to modern birds were consistently toothless.
Well, that took a while.
Yeah, it wasn't until the late Cretaceous that we basically had a more consistent, toothless, what they call crown birds, or the ancestors to modern birds. With ornithomimosaurs like Gallimimus, they had toothless beaks, and small to medium-sized ornithomimids are often thought of as opportunistic omnivores, so eating some meat and some plants. And maybe their beaks were good for that situation. But even the massive ornithomimid Dinosaurus had a toothless beak, so it wasn't just related to their size.
Oh, Dinosaurus.
Yeah. Dinosaurus was found with tons of gastroliths, and it would have needed those stones in its stomach to grind its huge plant intake, and that could be how it got away with not having teeth despite being big and eating a lot.
I wonder if for animals that have to ingest gastroliths, if that ever makes them feel bloated. Or I'm sure it makes them feel heavier.
Yeah. Well, there are some animals that are aquatic that have gastroliths, and it's thought that they do it purely for weight purposes. So yeah, it probably does. And it might mean that some of these dinosaurs would have to swim differently depending on how many gastroliths they ate.
Or walk differently.
Maybe.
You got stones rumbling around in there.
Yeah. The ctenonathids also had toothless beaks. Those are the so-called recent jaws because they have jaws that are similar to paleognaths or things like ostriches. And they're mostly famous for having that big crest on their head, sort of helmet-like. The massive Gigantoraptor is a ctenonathid. and it was also toothless. Based on its beak shape and strength, it's possible that it hunted at times, but most likely the current thinking is that it got a majority of its calories from plants, which is funny for something called a raptor.
Yeah.
I guess it's stealing plants or seizing plants.
It's a giant plant Caesar.
Yep. There's also a new paper that just came out in January of this year by Isara Aguilar Pedrez and others looking at toothless jaws, and they found that toothless jaws seem to have co-evolved with beak keratin. In other words, beaks replaced teeth, but it's not that simple because many dinosaurs have both beaks and teeth, including often having teeth directly behind the beaks.
Oh. But beaks help if you're going to lose teeth.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. What they found was that the evolution of the beak didn't suppress the teeth from growing, but, quote, the evolution of strong chemical digestion, a gizzard, and a dietary shift to omnivory or herbivory likely alleviated selective pressures for tooth development, end quote. So you could say having the beak there sort of allowed them to not have the teeth as long as they had these other factors that might have meant that they didn't need the teeth as much. Weirdly, enantiornithines don't seem to have gastroliths, so their path to toothlessness was probably different.
The opposite birds continue with their oppositeness.
Yeah, with their weirdness. I don't know what was going on with them, because we also don't necessarily think that enantiornithines were getting more herbivorous as they lost their teeth. So they're an interesting story for sure. All the dinosaurs that I mentioned earlier are theropods, and as far as I know, we don't have any sauropods or ornithischians with toothless beaks. I did some searching, but I couldn't find any. If you try to search toothless ornithischian or toothless sauropod, you just find a lot of, here's this other toothless dinosaur that is clearly a theropod. Including when you do journal searches, it's just, I couldn't find one, which is pretty strange when you compare the factors that they said lead to having a beak and not needing teeth, since they're mostly large herbivores in the sauropod and ornithischian groups.
My thought with the sauropods is that part of what made them so successful is they could go after vegetation that other animals couldn't, and some of that vegetation might have been kind of hard to eat, because I know they used, a lot of cases, their teeth to strip the plants.
Yeah, that's true. But they also, people have proposed they had a really small skull because a lighter weight skull was better at the end of a long neck. And if they could replace some of their skull with beak with lighter keratin and not have the teeth and all the extra deep mouth that's required to go along with that, you could see that being an advantage.
I'd love to see a beaky sauropod.
Yeah, me too. And so hopefully if one of those exists, someone will tell us that we missed it. I don't think we missed it, but if we did, I'd love to be proven wrong.
Maybe it'll be discovered in the future.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have skulls for tons of sauropods. I'd also like to see a pure beak on a ornithischian. I thought maybe there might be a ceratopsian, so I tried digging around, seeing if there was a ceratopsian without teeth. But as far as I can find, they all had at least some teeth.
And a lot of them had those dental batteries.
Yeah. They seem to be going the opposite direction, getting more and more teeth throughout time.
It was working for them.
Yeah, including in sauropods. Some of the later sauropods had like 1,000 teeth. So yeah, it's like evolution is always weird. You get some groups that are going toothless, other groups that are going tons of teeth. Just like you get the some groups that are going small and some groups that are going huge.
Yep. I think that's partly why we like dinosaurs so much.
Yeah.
They're so weird and varied. Well, that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we'll have our April Fool's episode. Figure we might as well start announcing it because we've been doing it long enough that some people have come to expect it.
Yeah.
If you want to hear more from us, then head over to iknowdino.com. That way you can sign up for our newsletter and get even more dinosaur goodness. Thanks again, and until next time.